The cold settles into the concrete. It's December 25th, 1989. But there is no peace, no goodwill here. Just the brittle, iron-grey sky pressing down on a barren military base in Targovist. The air smells of diesel, frozen earth, and fear. Two figures stand, shivering, against a rough, pockmarked wall. A man and a woman. Their clothes, once fine wool and tailored cuts, are now dishevelled. The man's overcoat is too large for his frame. The man, Nicolae Ceaușescu, once the conjugator of Romania, seems not to hear them. His wife, Elena, hears every syllable. Her whisper becomes audible. No, no, this is not possible. The soldiers, a hastily assembled squad, shift their weight. Their boots crunch on the gravel. They avoid looking at the couple directly. A camera is present, its lens a dark, unblinking eye. This will not be a secret burial, but a documented execution. The order is given. The rifles rise in unison, a stark silhouette against the white winter sky. Elena's scream is cut short by a single, shouted command. Then, a staccato roar tears the silence apart. The camera shakes. The bodies slump. And just like that, the 24-year reign of Nicolae Ceaușescu ends not with a slow decline, but with a violent, shocking rupture. This is the final, brutal frame of a story decades in the making. People learned to speak in code, to swallow their words with their morning coffee, which was often bitter and in short supply. And then came the cult. Not gradually, but with the force of a state mandate. Portraits of Ceaușescu multiplied. They stared from every office, every classroom, every street corner. His speeches were not broadcast. They were rituals, mandatory listening for a captive nation. The image was carefully crafted. The genial din Carpati, the genius of the Carpathians. Elena, his wife, was elevated from a semi-literate factory worker to a scientist of world renown, her name plastered on academic papers she could barely comprehend. The smell of their world was the smell of cheap printing ink on propaganda posters, and beneath it, the scent of fear. The 1970s brought the grand projects. Bucharest would be reshaped in the conjugator's image. The historic heart of the city, a tapestry of churches, homes, and winding streets, was bulldozed. In its place rose the gargantuan palace of the people, a marble-clad monument of staggering scale. The dust from construction never seemed to settle. It coated windows, lined throats, a physical manifestation of a regime grinding its own past into powder. In the perpetual dusk, families huddled around radios, listening through static to Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, the forbidden sounds a lifeline to a world outside. The supermarket shelves held only vinegar and stale bread. The smell of queuing, for a scrap of meat, for a bottle of oil, was the smell of unwashed wool and damp concrete. Children went to school with the lights off. Hospitals operated without anesthesia. This was the golden age, as the propaganda ceaselessly declared. And through it all, the eyes watched. The Securitate grew to 1 in 30 Romanians being an informer or officer. Silence became a survival skill. A misplaced joke, a sigh of discontent, could mean a lost job, a midnight knock, a disappearance. The Ceaușescus lived in a parallel universe, in palaces with crystal chandeliers and well-stocked larders, surrounded by sycophants who told them only what they wished to hear. They believed their own myth. They believed the people loved them. But pressure was building deep underground, like tectonic plates grinding against one another. The stench of corruption and deprivation was too potent to be masked by propaganda. The world was changing. The Iron Curtain was rusting. In Poland, solidarity was rising. In East Germany, protests simmered. But Ceaușescu, isolated in his palace of lies, saw himself as invincible. He was the one who had stood up to Moscow. He was the genius. He could not see the fault line cracking beneath his feet, a line that would first split open not in the capital, but in a dusty, overlooked city on the edge of the empire. The spark did not come from Bucharest. It came from the west, from the city of Timișoara, a place with a history of defiance. The air there, in December 1989, was thick with coal smoke and a different kind of tension. A local Hungarian Reformed pastor, Laszlo Tokes, had become a voice of conscience, criticizing the regime in his sermons. The state moved to silence him, evicting him from his parish home. But on December 15th, something shifted. A handful of parishioners, then dozens, then hundreds, formed a human chain around his apartment building. They were not politicians or activists. They were factory workers, students, grandparents. Their breath fogged in the cold air. They held candles. The flame, a tiny act of defiance against the overwhelming dark, passed from hand to hand. The sight was haunting. Silent faces illuminated in the flickering glow, a living wall protecting one man. The Securitate watched, confounded. This was not a riot. It was a vigil. And it was contagious. By the next day, the crowd had swelled into the thousands. They spilled from the churchyard into the opera square. The hymns shifted to chants. Noi suntem popul. We are the people. The sound was a low rumble at first, then a roar that shook the windows. For the first time in decades, Romanians were speaking in a voice that was not a sanctioned chorus. The regime panicked. In Bucharest, Ceaușescu received reports of hooligans and foreign agents. He gave the order. On December 17th, the army and Securitate units moved in. Tanks ground their treads over the cobblestones. The smell of fear was now mixed with the acrid tang of diesel and wet wool. The order to fire was given. The crack of gunfire was not the disciplined burst of a firing squad. It was chaotic, sustained, horrific. People scattered, slipped on ice, fell. The sound of screams was swallowed by the roar of engines and weapons. Bodies lay on the grey slush, red spreading out from them in shocking contrast. They died in doorways, behind fountains, in the arms of strangers. The details that emerged later were searing. A young man cut in half by machine gun fire. A woman shot while hanging a white flag from her balcony. Timișoara was no longer a city. It was a crime scene. But the state made a fatal error. They tried to hide the evidence. They rounded up the dead, loaded them into trucks under cover of darkness, and transported them to Bucharest. There, in a clandestine operation, the bodies were incinerated, the identities erased. They wanted the martyrs to vanish. But you cannot erase a whisper that has become a scream. The news, fractured and chaotic, seeped out through crackling radio transmissions and desperate phone calls. A rumor took hold, more powerful than any decree. a massacre in Timișoara. The Securitate is murdering children. The poison had entered the bloodstream of the nation. Nicolae Ceaușescu, insulated and supremely confident, decided to perform an act he had mastered, the grand public address. He would speak to the people from the balcony of the Central Committee building in Bucharest South Palace Square. He believed he could calm them, command them, remind them of their love for him. It was December 21st, 1989. The morning was overcast, cold. A crowd of 100,000 was bussed in by party directive, given flags and banners. They stood in the vast square, a sea of grey coats under a grey sky. He appeared on the balcony, a small, familiar figure in a heavy overcoat and fur hat. Elena stood beside him, wrapped in fur. He began to speak, his voice, that familiar reedy rasp, amplified across the square. He spoke of achievements, of sovereignty, of socialist victory. He announced a paltry wage increase. He expected the ritual applause, the synchronized chants. But from the back of the crowd, a sound rose. It wasn't a cheer. It was a boo. A single, isolated sound that cut through the manufactured silence. Then another. And then, like a dam breaking, the sound swelled, a thunderous, unified roar of disapproval. The camera on Ceaușescu's face captured the precise moment his reality shattered. His eyes widened. He jerked back from the microphone as if struck. He raised a hand, patting the air in a gesture of bewildered paternal admonishment. "ALO, ALO," he said, tapping the MIC. This was not a technical malfunction. This was the system rejecting its creator. The look on his face was one of pure, uncomprehending terror. It was the look of a man who has just heard the walls of his own tomb slam shut. Elena leaned in, her face a grim mask of fury, hissing something in his ear. Below, the crowd's roar transformed into a chant. Timișoara, Timișoara. The name of the martyred city became a weapon. The Securitate agents in the crowd looked at each other, unsure. The script was gone. Ceaușescu fled inside, the broadcast cutting off abruptly. The image that lingers is his stunned, backward retreat, a man disappearing into the darkness of the building as the roar of the people he claimed to own followed him in. That night, Bucharest erupted. The streets, so long empty and silent after curfew, filled with people. They poured into the boulevards, a torrent of pent-up anger and sudden, terrifying freedom. They tore down portraits of the conjugator, setting the paper faces ablaze in bonfires that lit up the night. The smell of burning propaganda mixed with the cold air. But the revolution was not over. It was about to enter its darkest, most chaotic chapter. The Securitate had not surrendered. They would fight for their world. And the army, confused and torn, would have to choose a side. The stage was set for a battle not just for political control, but for the soul of the city itself, a battle that would be fought street by street, building by building, with rumors of terrorist snipers and shadowy forces turning the capital into a war zone. The night of December 21st was not a celebration. It was a release of pressure so immense it became its own kind of terror. Bucharest was no longer a governed city. It was a soundscape of chaos, the crash of breaking glass, the roar of crowds, the sputter of Molotov cocktails igniting, and underneath it all, the eerie, sporadic crackle of gunfire. The darkness was pierced by headlights and flames. The Securitate headquarters, a monolithic fortress known as the Cottage, became a pulsating nerve center of resistance, its windows glowing like angry eyes. On the morning of the 22nd, the world watched, transfixed, as Romanian state television, now seized by revolutionary forces, broadcast from a studio littered with cigarette butts and coffee cups. The announcers, engineers, and young soldiers looked exhausted, wired on adrenaline. They declared the fall of Ceaușescu. But where was he? The mystery fueled the chaos. Rumors swirled. He was in the Central Committee building directing a counterattack. He was hiding in the subway tunnels. He had fled to Moscow. The airwaves were a chaotic mix of triumphant announcements and desperate pleas for information about terrorists. The truth was almost absurd. After his balcony debacle, Ceaușescu and Elena had barricaded themselves inside the Central Committee building. The building was a labyrinth of marble halls and secret passages, now a tomb of their own making. They could hear the roar of the crowd outside, like a rising flood. At noon, with the help of a loyal bodyguard, they made a desperate dash for the roof. The sound of a helicopter, a dull, rhythmic thudding, cut through the cacophony below. They scrambled aboard, the aircraft lurching into the sky. From above, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu looked down for the last time on their capital, a city seething in revolt. The helicopter pilot, however, was already betraying them. Following orders from a chain of command that was disintegrating by the minute, he flew not to a safe haven, but to the countryside, eventually setting down near the city of Targovist. They were in protective custody, they were told. It was the beginning of their end. Back in Bucharest, the revolution turned inward. A new, more terrifying phase began, the battle against the terrorists. Who were they? Securitate loyalists? Foreign agents? It was never clear. But the effect was psychological warfare. Snipers, real or imagined, fired from rooftops. The air rang with the panic cry, "Attenti, terroristii." Watch out, terrorists. People ducked behind burnt-out cars, ran in zigzags across boulevards. The wide, grand boulevardal Magaru became a deadly gauntlet. The National Art Museum, the University Library, their beautiful facades were pockmarked with bullet holes. The city smelled of cordite, burning rubber, and fierce sweat. In the television studio, the new National Salvation Front Council, a hastily assembled group of former communists and dissidents, tried to project control. But their most powerful tool was the broadcast itself. They put the revolution on live television, a raw, uncensored reality show of a nation's nervous breakdown. Viewers saw young men with bandanas over their faces firing hunting rifles at unseen enemies. They saw doctors operating on wounded civilians in hospital hallways. They saw the bodies. This was not curated news. It was a national séance, a collective trauma playing out in real time. And through it all, the question persisted: what to do with the Ceaușescus? They were now hidden in a remote military base, a crumbling 15th century fortification. Their captivity was surreal. They were kept in separate rooms, furnished with simple army cots. Nicolae demanded his medication. Elena complained about the food. They still believed this was a misunderstanding, that the army would restore them to power. They spent their time writing, in looping, frantic script, letters to various Communist Party committees that no longer existed. The outside world demanded a trial. The new leadership, fearing a rallying point for loyalists, knew they had to act, and act quickly. The trial was a foregone conclusion. It was held on Christmas Day, in a small, sparse room within the base. A makeshift tribunal was assembled. Soldiers, low-ranking judges. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool uniforms and cheap cigarettes. Ceaușescu and Elena were brought in. He wore his overcoat, looking shrunken and defiant. She was in a dark dress, her face set in a permanent scowl of contempt. They refused to recognize the court. "I am your president. I am your leader." Nicolae shouted, his voice hoarse. Elena interrupted, calling the judges fascists and traitors. The charges were read: genocide, undermining the national economy, subverting state power. The evidence was the entire suffering of a nation over 24 years. It lasted less than 2 hours. The sentence was death. No appeal. The verdict was to be carried out immediately. They were led out into the courtyard. The wall they stood against was stained with old moss and mildew. A soldier tied a rough, white cloth around Nicolae's eyes. He refused. Elena screamed, "We gave you everything. We were your mothers and fathers." The squad of paratroopers, their faces hardened by the bloody days in Bucharest, raised their rifles. One soldier hesitated, lowering his gun. A commanding officer barked, "Shoot them." Nicolae Ceaușescu's last words were lost in the sudden, deafening roar. He began singing the Internationale, the communist anthem. He did not finish. The bodies twitched on the frozen ground. A medic stepped forward, perfunctorily checking for pulses. The camera, held by a soldier, captured it all: the slumped forms, the dark blood spreading on the concrete. The footage, grainy and shocking, was flown to Bucharest and broadcast that evening. A nation watched in stunned silence. The genial din party was gone, not in a heroic battle, but in a squalid, violent execution. A profound, unsettling quiet descended over the country. The gunfire in Bucharest, almost miraculously, began to cease. The gunshots in Targovist did not just kill 2 people. They severed nerve. In Bucharest, the sudden silence was more deafening than the gunfire had been. The pervasive crackle of small arms fire, the shouts of terroristii that had haunted the city for 3 days, simply stopped. It was as if a switch had been thrown. People emerged from doorways and behind barricades, their faces smudged with soot and exhaustion, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. The air, still heavy with the smells of burning and cordite, now carried a new scent, the sharp, clean odor of snow beginning to fall, slowly blanketing the scars of battle. The broadcast of the execution footage that evening was a collective trauma administered as a national sedative. Families gathered around their televisions, watching the grainy, shaky images in disbelief. There was no triumph in their living rooms, only a hollow numbness. The omnipotent father and mother of the nation were now corpses on a concrete slab. For some, it was justice, swift and brutal. For others, even those who hated them, it was a shocking, uncharted descent into a new kind of violence. The myth of the state, already shattered, was now replaced with a raw, unsettling reality. Power could end like this. The immediate fallout was a vacuum. The National Salvation Front, led by Ion Iliescu, a former Communist Party official who had fallen out with Ceaușescu, moved swiftly to fill it. But the revolution had a name now: Revolution Romania. And it demanded heroes. The television studios, now the symbolic heart of the new power, began broadcasting relentless, emotional montages set to soaring classical music. They showed images of the young martyrs of Timișoara and Bucharest, their faces smiling from school photos. They showed crowds waving the Romanian flag with the communist coat of arms cut violently from its center, leaving a ragged hole. This was the powerful, unifying narrative, a brave people rising as one to slay a dragon. But on the streets, a different story was already curdling. The terrorists who had sown so much chaos and death seemed to have vanished into thin air. Who were they? Questions, whispered at first, grew louder. Many of the fiercest firefights had taken place around key state buildings, the TV station, the Interior Ministry, buildings that the new leaders now occupied. Some began to point out that the army, which had eventually sided with the people, used tanks and heavy machine guns, while the terrorists were often described as using small arms and sniper tactics. A sinister theory took root, that elements within the old regime, including parts of the Securitate and even factions of the new NSF, had orchestrated the second, more chaotic phase of violence to discredit the revolution's purity and justify a swift authoritarian takeover. The evidence was circumstantial, but haunting. The sheer number of casualties, over 1,000 dead, thousands wounded, seemed disproportionate to a resistance by a few secret police fanatics. There were reports of soldiers firing on each other in the fog of war, of confused, friendly fire incidents. The atmosphere of paranoia had been so total, so effective, it now seemed like a weapon itself. The revolution, it appeared, may have been hijacked midway through its flight. The new government moved quickly to consolidate. Trials of former Ceaușescu officials began, but they were often shambolic, theatrical affairs. The deeper state, the vast network of Securitate informers, was never fully purged. Files disappeared. Many former communists simply changed their coats and joined the new political class. The promised utopia was slow to arrive. The stores remained empty, the economy a wreck. The intoxicating unity of December began to fracture by spring, as students and intellectuals who had manned the barricades realized the revolution had not brought renewal, but a rebranding. In June 1990, the government would violently crush a peaceful protest in University Square, using miners bussed in as shock troops, an event that smelled of the old ways, of staged anger and manufactured chaos. The long-term consequences were a national identity built on a contested memory. Romania had to build a new future on the foundation of a revolution whose true narrative was slippery, disputed. The physical scars on Bucharest's buildings were patched over, but the bullet holes were sometimes left visible, preserved as reminders. The Palace of the People, Ceaușescu's monstrous legacy, was completed, and became the seat of Parliament, a constant, looming presence, a symbol of a past too massive to tear down. For the people, the fallout was personal and profound. A society trained in silence for decades now had to learn to speak, to debate, to accuse. Families discovered that relatives, friends, neighbors had been informers. The trust that had been broken from above now shattered horizontally, between citizens. The emotional landscape was one of disillusionment mixed with a fierce, protective pride for those days in December. To question the revolution's legitimacy felt like betraying the martyrs. Yet, to ignore the questions was to live with a ghost in the national attic. The debate among historians is sharp, unresolved. One school sees December 1989 as a genuine, spontaneous popular uprising that was brutally contested by the regime and then shrewdly co-opted by second-tier communists. Another posits a more cynical palace coup, where factions within the party and army used the public's anger to remove Ceaușescu, then orchestrated the violence to terrify the population into accepting a new, softer authoritarianism. The truth likely lies in a chaotic, ugly middle, a true revolution commandeered before it could reach its destination. The unsettling fact remains: the full story of those bloody days may never be known. Too many documents were destroyed. Too many participants have conflicting stories. The revolution was lived in a haze of adrenaline, fear, and propaganda, and documented through the same distorted lens. It exists now in memory as a series of stark, cinematic images: the candles in Timișoara, Ceaușescu's stunned face on the balcony, the Christmas Day execution, the young faces of the dead. And so, the downfall of Nicolae Ceaușescu stands not as a neat moral fable of good triumphing over evil, but as a complex, dark thriller where the heroes are ambiguous and the final act leaves more questions than answers. The dragon was slain, but in the resulting smoke, new shapes emerged from the shadows, shapes that looked disquietingly familiar. The Romanian people won their freedom, but at a cost etched in mystery and blood, a cost they are still calculating decades later, in a country forever marked by the violent, ambiguous birth of its new self.